The following content is brought to you by Chorlton Evangelical Church, in Manchester, UK. Our location is M21, 9FG. Our Sunday services are at 11 a.m. and 6:30 p.m. For more information, visit our website, chorltonevangelical.org.
Well, the title for our message this evening is Gospel Priorities and Personal Sacrifice. Gospel Priorities and Personal Sacrifice. And we'll be thinking about the verses 15 to the end. If you've got that passage open, it would be useful. And for those of you who like a structure, we'll be thinking about three short sections tonight. So in verses 15 to 18, we see that the Apostle Paul refuses his rights for the sake of the gospel. Paul explains on a particular issue why he refuses certain rights for the sake of the gospel. And then in verses 19 to 23, we're going to find out about a lesson in gospel servanthood. A lesson in gospel servanthood. And then in the last section, to the end, we're going to find out about the necessity of self-discipline. So three areas: why he refuses to exercise his rights, a lesson in gospel servanthood, and the necessity of self-discipline. Now, Paul wants to introduce us to a truth tonight, a great principle. And that is that when it comes to the spread of the gospel is his ultimate priority. That's why he lives and works and preaches. That's what consumes him, to preach the gospel, the spread of the gospel, the benefit of the gospel. And when it comes to the gospel, if there's something, a particular practice that aids the gospel without compromising it or without bringing it into disrepute, he'll adopt it. And if there's a particular practice that he does or holds on to or is in the culture which is not beneficial to the gospel, he's happy to stand it down if it's not a great issue of principle or compromise. He introduces us to the principle that he's prepared to suffer personal hardship for the spread of the gospel and the benefit of the Church of Christ. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard great theology preached. You might not hear it tonight, but if you listen to someone like Dr. Lloyd Jones, or you've heard a great sermon in your Christian life or read a Christian book when it's moved you. Have you ever heard something presented and your thinking has changed forever? I don't know if you've ever experienced that. The way that you viewed something has been shifted. The tectonic plates of your mind has been shifted by the power of the preached word. I can remember a time in my life where my life was changed and influenced not by the preaching of theology in a very classical and dynamic way, but when theology was lived out by an individual. When I was a member of the Methodist Church, after the evening service, it was around 8, 9 o'clock, the minister would take a load of young people back to his house, and he'd have a group. He'd set up a whiteboard, and he'd have a subject, and he'd invite us all to come. And some of the young people in their teenage years would be sat there with their Blur and Oasis t-shirts on. They weren't from the local church. You can see how long ago it was. And there were Christians who attended the church, all mixed together. And the minister would take a subject, and he'd put up with us. There'd be people spilling their fizzy drinks on his carpet. There'd be children with all kinds of habits that were outside of the church. And after we'd finished, sometimes I'd stayed on. He had a bacon butty, and he took the dog for a walk around the block. Now, his wife said to me, he's absolutely shattered. He's preached 2 sermons, and he's had a house full of people. He always has his bacon butty just to try and revive him. Now, he had the right to sit there all evening and enjoy his bacon butty after he preached 2 sermons, to have a quiet night with his family. That was his right. Nothing wrong with that. He'd done plenty. But he chose to have a load of rabulous young people round in his front room for another hour and a half and listen to all their questions and difficulties and put himself out. Why? For the sake of the gospel. And that moment in my life I saw lived out in that person what Paul is talking about, that he was prepared for the sake of the gospel to be a great servant. Gospel priorities and personal sacrifice. Now, we learned 3 principles in the first half of this passage, and I'd like to bring them to you before we look at our verses. The first principle is this. Paul told us in the first part of the chapter that he had the right to receive support as an apostle. If you wanted to pay anybody in gospel work, you'd pay the Apostle Paul, wouldn't you? You'd hire him, wouldn't you? You'd give him all the support he needs. He was a true apostle, and he appealed to the people themselves. Aren't you my workmanship? Did you come through my ministry? He had the right, said the apostle, to eat and drink, and his family. So the Apostle Paul didn't have a wife. We believe he was a widower, and his wife had probably died. But he was single. But if he'd have had a family, this was his right. Principle number 1, he had the right to support from the church. Now he's continuing on a theme from chapter 8. And in chapter 8, he talked about the fact that he was willing to stand down certain issues for weaker people. In verse 13, just before this chapter, he says, "Therefore, if food will make my brother stumble, I will never eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble." If there's this small thing that's going to cause trouble for the sake of the gospel, and even though it's my right to do it, and it's completely legitimate, and we're not talking about sinful things here, legitimate things, I will stand it down for the sake of the gospel. And he continues over that theme, but the subject he takes up is the subject of support in the ministry. So principle number 1, he has right to support in the Christian ministry, financial support. Second principle, he tells us, this is a natural principle in the world. You have the right to be maintained by the occupation that you take up. And he gives us some examples. A soldier. Have you ever heard of a soldier who goes to war and he runs an eBay account to make money, to raise the money for his bullets and his uniform? He does a little job on the side so he can go to war. No, a soldier is maintained by the government to be in the army. He does soldiering as he's living, so he should earn his pay from soldiering. If a person is a subsistence farmer, says the Apostle Paul, he has the right to have some of the harvest. He doesn't go to work and till the fields and have to have another job as well. He is maintained by his employment. That's a principle in the world. That's principle number 2 that he brought to us in that passage. So then he turns to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 25 and verse 4, and he gives us this illustration from the law of God. He's constantly building upon his arguments. Does it not eternally speak for our sake? Verse 9. For it is written, for the sake of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Isn't it for oxen not for oxen that God is concerned? So, that law, says the Apostle Paul, is not primarily about just the welfare of animals. So animals, under the law, should be cared for. If an oxen is pulling a mill round and round and round, and it's grinding corn, treading out the grain, you shouldn't put a muzzle on it so that it can't stop and take a little bit of food to support itself. And the Apostle Paul said, if God is concerned about animal welfare in that way, what about the actual servants of God? Are they not more important? Well, the principle extends to them as well, that it's right for a man who works in the gospel ministry to be supported by the ministry. And then in verse 14, he states it very, very clearly. In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. He even gives us an illustration from those who were Levitical priests. He's again building the argument. And he says in verse 13, do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? So he gives us the idea of a spiritual harvest, and we said that there was the Levitical priests, and they weren't to involve themselves in a secular job, but were to be supported in their work. All the time he's coming to this principle that he has the right to be supported in gospel work. But he makes an issue of an individual choice based on his own conscience. And that is, verse 15, what we're looking at, "But I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision." Now, Paul chooses not to take any pay for his work, but to support himself through manual work as a tent maker. Now, we know that he did take gifts from the church at Philippi, but when he went to a place like Corinth, his normal procedure was to take on board a manual job of tent making to support himself, because he felt that it dealt with a particular issue of his conscience. Now, he doesn't fully explain it in this passage, but commentators tell us that he didn't want people to make the offence that he only preached the gospel for monetary reward. So by doing a tent-making job, he took away that charge that could be made against him, that he only preached for monetary reward. Now, let me just say something about the individual conscience at this point. The individual conscience, or I should say, the conscience is very individual. That's how I should put it. The conscience is very individual. You know, people may look at somebody's decision and it may seem ludicrous. You know, here is a minister, the Apostle Paul. If anybody should devote all their time to the study of the Word of God and the work of God, why on earth would they inconvenience themselves by labouring, lifting heavy canvases and threads and doing manual work? It seems ridiculous, doesn't it? If you're going to do ministry, you should do it this way. Now, I don't know if you're like me, but I'm very formulaic. When it comes to tasks in life, I learn how to do it in a particular way that I think it should be done, and I apply my methodology to it. So if you're buying a particular type of car, you should buy this one. And if you've learned to do something, get a job in a particular way, you do it this way, and you can become very formulaic. There was a boy in my class at school, and his dad always used to buy Datsun cars. Do you remember Datsun cars? He used to rust, completely rust in a couple of years. The Datsun Laurel and the 200A. And when his car rusted away, he'd buy another Datsun. And everybody in the class said, well, he should buy Fords or he should do this. But he, in his own self, felt that these cars were good and liked them. Now, it's not a sinful choice, but it's not the choice that we would make. And it's very easy in the evangelical church to become formulaic in our approach. Everybody should approach every task in the way that we would do it. If you're going to do ministry, Paul, then you need this type of salary and this type of support. It's ridiculous to do a manual tent-making job. If you're going to use your time in this way, one person's decision of conscience may seem ridiculous. I knew a minister who, before he was saved, was a jazz pianist. And his life before he was converted involved drinking endless amounts of alcohol and playing the piano in jazz clubs. And when he became converted, he decided as an issue of conscience, he will get rid of all his jazz records at the time and wouldn't listen to jazz, because when he heard it, it brought back the associations to drink, and it brought back all the memories, and it sent him down a particular path. Now, to me, that seems a bit over the top, because I can listen to a jazz record and it doesn't bring me to do anything I don't think inherently sinful. But everybody's conscience is different. And so that's a lesson that we learn firstly from this, that the conscience is very individual. And sometimes the decisions that people make around the conscience may seem ridiculous to us. And certainly, as we look on in the ministry in this century, the idea that the Apostle Paul would support himself and stand down on this particular issue does seem quite amazing to us. So then look at verse 16. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting, for necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have reward, but if not of my own will, I am still entrusted with a stewardship. What then is my reward? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. So Paul's necessity in life is he has to preach the gospel. That's why he was called. That's nothing special. If you're a nanny, it's nothing to boast about to look after children. That's the job of a nanny, to look after children. The gospel minister's job is to preach and present the gospel. What Paul felt good about, what he felt pleased about, was that he felt he could do even more for the cause of Christ by taking up this particular position. I want you to imagine a little church. It's a struggling work, meeting in a community centre. And they find a retired man and they invite him to become the pastor. And they put together a small salary, just about enough to qualify as a salary. And when he sits down with the other elders to speak to them, he tells them, he says, I've run a business all my life, a big firm. And I'll pop in on a Thursday just to check a few emails. But if you'll allow me, I won't need to take the salary because I don't need it financially. And I won't have to deplete the funds of the church. And so I'm able to serve you as a pastor in my retired state, and I'm financially well off enough that if you allow me to go and check the emails in the firm on a Friday, I will be able to offer myself to the church. But more than that, I won't have to deplete the finances of the church. Now, this is a rather unusual situation, but I'm bringing it as an example where somebody is doing the thing but feels that for the cause of Christ, they can go even that little bit further to see the gospel spread and be a blessing to the church. The gospel was the Apostle Paul's greatest priority. This was the reason that he lived, and this was the reason that he worked. Now, what does the word priority mean? Because we need to ask ourselves the question, is the gospel our priority as a church, an individual? So I looked up the word priority in the dictionary. This is what it means. The fact or condition of being regarded as more important than others. So if you take an example, it gives an example. The safety of the country takes priority over any other matter. The fact or condition of being regarded as more important than other things. So we have to ask ourselves, in our lives, this is a great challenge, is the gospel a priority? Is the gospel a priority in this church? There's all kinds of things to do. There's decorating, there's catering, there's hospitality, there's building up of the saints, there's all these things, but is the gospel our major priority? Now, all around us, the gospel is being deconstructed. I don't know if you've ever heard of this word, deconstructed. There are churches that are frankly embarrassed about the gospel and have been for years. And they're replacing the gospel with a whole different program that's much more acceptable. But I don't know if you've even heard about people they call as deconstructors. Have you ever heard this term, or deconstructing their faith? So there are children who are brought up to Christian parents, and they go to university and they like certain aspects of the Christian faith, maybe the moral aspects of it, maybe the community aspects of it, and they don't want to completely throw off all the culture that they've been brought up in, but they're inherently embarrassed about the need of repentance and faith and heaven and hell and the need of conversion. And so they deconstruct the faith. They have some kind of faith, but they get rid of the miracles, they get rid of the need of personal conversion, they certainly get rid of the need of preaching the gospel. And when they move away, they find a church which will accommodate them in this palatable manner, and they too have deconstructed the gospel. It's a term that you'll hear used around us. Or in some churches, it's been downgraded. You'll hear about people who go out to preach on the streets and they can't find anybody else to go with them. They're the only person in the church who will go there. The gospel has been downgraded in the priorities of the church. So what does it mean, the word gospel, and what does it mean to preach the gospel? Now, I turned to an article. It's not my article. It's by Stephen Lawson, who writes for Ligonier. And he says that we preach the gospel as a pastor in 4 ways. So firstly, the gospel should be preached, the pastor should preach the gospel to himself. So there are unconverted pastors out there in the church of God. So firstly, the pastor should be thoroughly converted. He should be a man who has preached the gospel and accepted the gospel himself. Then he says that we should preach to our children. And this is important. The children in the church need to hear the gospel, but our own children as ministers of the gospel. Then number 3 says we need to preach the gospel to the flock, because in every flock, in every meeting, even in gospel churches, there are unconverted people. So there need to be specific messages, or within our preaching, the cross and the repentance, preached regularly to the flock. But then he says, and I quote, fourthly, every pastor should evangelize the community. And I quote from his article, every pastor should evangelize the community. The strategies will differ from one man to the next, depending on his gift and opportunities. As a fisher of men, he must go where the fish are. He must leave the dry land and sail out into the deep waters and cast his net. Pastors must venture out into the community, share the gospel and urge people to believe upon Christ. Community outreach involves building bridges with unbelievers. This may include hosting a Bible study in an office, a restaurant or a home. It can involve a local radio programme, a newspaper editorial or an internet blog. It means showing acts of mercy with a gospel presentation. Whatever the strategy, making such inroads requires going where the unconverted people are and unashamedly sharing Christ. It has been rightly said that the greatest joy is knowing Christ. Second is making him known. May every pastor enter joyfully into this privilege of doing the work of an evangelist. So we read that verse at the start from 2 Timothy, and Paul writes to Timothy and says, not be an evangelist, and that word is used twice in the New Testament, and it always means to preach to unconverted people, but he tells a pastor to do the work of an evangelist. So preaching must be our priority, and we must be prepared to suffer for the sake of the gospel if it's going to advance. We must be prepared to be inconvenienced for the gospel, even though we have the right to legitimate things. So let me ask you the question, is the gospel a priority for you? Now you may say to me, I'm not a minister, I'm not an elder, and here we're listening to advice given to a pastor. What about us? Well, in the gospel church, it's possible to be involved in those priorities and have those priorities, whether you're a pastor, leader, or teacher. During the Second World War, there was a war cabinet. You'll remember some of the names, like Anthony Eden, Clement Attlee. But there was one member of the cabinet who was very creative called Lord Beaverbrook. He had a son called Max Beaverbrook, and he was a great newspaper mogul. And he had great creativity and had a way of stirring the nation. And he was responsible for these campaigns where people used to donate their aluminium pots and pans, old metal toothpaste tubes, and it was all supposed to be for aircraft production. So they were going to Spitfires and metal for planes that would fight in the war. And his son Max said on one of the documentaries, very little of the metal ever made it to the aircraft furnaces, but it kept in the minds of the country the cause. It kept in people's minds that they were part of what was going on. It kept them focused upon the great task in hand. And so, if we're a gospel church with gospel priorities, you may not be somebody who is an evangelist out on the street, but is your mind, is your thoughts, are your prayers upon these things? Are we working together in this task? The gospel is the great priority. Now let's look at the next section, verses 19 to 23. And these words have caused great controversy in the church. And I'd like to just make a few comments upon them. And Paul says that he is a gospel servant, and in order for the expansion of the gospel, he is prepared to become all things to all men. And he gives us 3 characteristics of people that he appeals to. So the first people that he appeals to are the Jews under the law. In verse 20, The second are the Gentiles, those who are outside of the law. And the third are the weak. Now, I don't know about you, but there are those that have totally misrepresented these verses and have brought all kinds of things into the church. So we need to ask the question clearly, what is Paul actually saying? What does he actually mean when he becomes all things to all men, when he actually becomes a Jew to become a Jew? Well, when there is no principle at stake, he will fit in with what's going on if it will win an ear for the gospel. I wish that people would have read the whole of 1 Corinthians when they sometimes apply this. And you'll remember that in the first couple of chapters, Paul goes to great lengths to say, when he goes to Corinth, he doesn't go there to appeal to the culture. When he goes there cross-culturally. He goes there weak and feeble, with nothing but the bare, unadorned gospel of Christ. And so that the power of God may be well known to those people, he doesn't try and appeal to the Greeks or to their wisdom. He goes simply with the gospel, and he doesn't try and adopt the ungodly practices of the culture in order to win a hearing of the gospel. I wish people had read chapter 2 when they get involved in all kinds of things around these particular issues. Now let me just quote from one commentary. When Paul wanted to take the young convert Timothy with himself and Silas on a missionary journey, he circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. Was that a compromise? After all, this is the same Paul who could write that in Christ neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything. And again, that neither circumcision counts for anything nor uncircumcision, but a new creation in Galatians 6:15. The answer must be negative, because the reason why Paul had Timothy circumcised was nothing to do with the gospel per se, and everything to do with not causing needless offence to legalistic Jews, who otherwise might never have begun to listen to his message about the Messiah. Similarly, in Acts 21:26, we find him carefully observing the rules of Jewish purification at the Jerusalem temple, along with his companions, precisely to avoid needless offence, even though he knew that he did not need the temple and its rules to bring him to God. When preaching in Jews' synagogues, Paul habitually used Old Testament arguments, examples and quotations in order to prove the identity of the Lord Jesus Christ to those who were in bondage under the law. Of course, he refused to return to that slavery and would never compromise the free grace of the gospel. But he was prepared to become their slave in all the areas of Jewish culture that were neutral with regard to the gospel as to win the Jews. When dealing with the Gentiles, with those outside the law, he followed the same principle. In all neutral Gentile areas, he was prepared to accommodate himself to Gentile cultural thought and practice so as not to raise unnecessary barriers to the gospel. The book of Acts furnishes examples of this at the historic Council of Jerusalem, where it was agreed that we should not trouble those Gentiles who turned to God. It was not necessary to follow Jewish rites and ceremonies in order to be a Christian. Similarly, when addressing the Areopagus in Athens, it was a cultural setting and the thought forms of the Gentiles that dictated Paul's presentation and application of the good news. So Paul was prepared to stand down minor issues when it comes to the gospel, but he didn't believe that those things were a necessity for salvation. I gave you the illustration of a couple that end up on an island as missionaries. On the island, there's been a history of certain beliefs regarding pork. It's well within their rights that on a Saturday morning they can enjoy a bacon butty together or have a barbecue and put a pork chop on it. It's in their rights. It's not sinful as a Christian in the New Testament to do those things. But they know that everybody on that island, if they find out that they've got pork in their house and they eat bacon butties, will never come anywhere near them. They know that it will cause trouble for Christians who have parents in that culture. And so for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of the spread of the gospel, they're prepared to stand down that right in order for the gospel to proceed. These are the issues that Paul is getting at. But unfortunately in the church, people have said what we need to do is, in order to win people, especially unconverted people, we've got to become like them in order to be relevant, or else the gospel will get nowhere. I was trying to find some examples to give you. There's many to give. If you go on the BBC website, there's an article going back to 2019 where Norwich Cathedral put up inside it a full-size helter-skelter. A full-size helter-skelter. If you don't know what one of those is, it's a big slide they used to have at the fairground. And they were trying to apologise for this, and people had criticised them, saying, what on earth are you doing, put up in a helter-skelter, and the minister's going down the slide, and it's part of the outreach. And they gave this statement: part of the cathedral's mission to share the story of the Bible is to do it in creative and innovative ways. Norwich Cathedral is not the only place of worship to use unconventional methods to attract members of the public. The central aisle of Rochester Cathedral was also converted to a crazy golf course. Now this is why have we ended up in these areas? Why have we ended up with churches putting helter-skelters up, or adopting rap music in the worship, or compromising on all these things? Because people have read verses like this and said, well, in order to win people, in order to get unconverted into the church, we've got to appeal to the unconverted. Why would I not go to the beer festival down the road, mix with people and do it as a gospel outreach? Because if a person was converted, they'd have to leave that lifestyle behind. They'd have to stop going to places where people are half-dressed and drunk. They'd have to be changed and completely different. And so Paul would never adopt methods which would compromise the gospel or do down the gospel. You'll see many methods like this upon the visible church. Have you ever heard of the messy church? This is a very popular idea. My mum takes her grandchildren to the messy church. It's on a Thursday night. It's just like, I said to her, it's not even a church. It's just a craft group on a Thursday night. There's nothing wrong with it, with the Bible content. But I've heard of churches where they've stopped their morning service on a Sunday. And members of the church have been annoyed. They've gone to the church service, gone into the church, and the pews have all been moved, or chairs have been moved, and craft is set up, and the morning service has been sacrificed, and the worship of God, for craft to appeal to unconverted families and their children. Now, is that a way of becoming all things to all men so that we win some? Or is that compromising the gospel? Now, the point of the gospel is that people who don't like the Bible will be so changed by the message of the cross that they will come to love it. That people that want nothing to do with reverent worship may come to love reverent worship because they've been transformed by the gospel. Would any of us want to go to a prayer meeting unless the gospel had thoroughly changed us? Now, there's a great place for craft groups and appealing to unconverted people, but to do away with the worship of God, to mean that the people of God have no food, to take away the morning service, well, these are things that we've got to work through. Paul said that when it comes to small and side issues, if it meant that it wouldn't hinder the gospel, he was willing to stand down on those things. He was willing to become a servant. He was willing to be inconvenienced. Let me give you a positive application. It's Saturday night. There's some programmes on the TV that you like to enjoy. There's nothing wrong with that. But you know there's a particular individual on the fringe of the church who, if you ring them and make contact with them, they're most likely to come on, they're more likely to come on a Sunday morning. Now, you're within your rights to say, no, this is my time, I'm free as an individual to use it as I like, but because of the gospel, I choose to inconvenience myself and ring this individual and spend time with them for the benefit of the gospel. I would say that is a positive application of the things that we have been talking about. Well, let's just take the last section in closing. We won't have time to cover this in full, but let's just refer to it. The fact of self-discipline. Now, Paul brings these three areas. If the gospel is going to advance, we need people who are prepared to preach the gospel with a passion, to be gripped by it, to be servants for the gospel, to be prepared to inconvenience themselves for the gospel, to be prepared to be adaptable, to meet with people. But lastly, if the gospel is going to advance, it's going to be with a life of self-discipline. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-controls in all things, but they do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. Paul uses the idea of a race to illustrate the Christian life in Hebrews, doesn't he, in chapter 12? Lay aside every weight that besets you. Strip for action to run. Don't have anything that hinders you. Even legitimate things that would hinder you in the course of the gospel and the work of God. Get rid of them. If you're a deacon and somebody gives you a static caravan so that you can go away every weekend and have wonderful holidays so much that you're never in the church, you're never there to serve, do away with it. If it's going to be a hindrance to your Christian life, if there's something legitimate in your Christian life that's going to hold you back, it might not be simple, do away with it, says the apostle. Run the race with self-discipline and self-control. This is how he applies himself to prayer. We're never going to make inroads for the gospel if we don't have self-discipline, if we don't apply ourselves to the task. And then this great worry that he has in verse 27, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. You know, often Paul brings photographs of people, or photographs of people in the church from the 1980s or the 1990s, and we all enjoy looking at them. I enjoy looking at them. There are people I don't know who they are. I ask him, who's that? Who's that? And some of the people on the photographs are still here. Some of them are still here from the 1980s. And there are others, and people say, oh yes, that's so-and-so. They used to come, but we don't see them anymore. They fell away. Friends, that's the great worry to the Apostle Paul, that sin, distraction or failure, he might drop out of the race and be disqualified. Remember that we're under attack on all sides and that we need to keep running. We can't stand still. We said before, it's a bit like riding a bike. You have to keep pedalling or you fall off. But let me close by saying this. If we want to advance the gospel, what does this passage teach us? These are the three most important categories that we need in people. The gospel has advanced here because certain people have paid the price. Certain people have been prepared to be inconvenienced and suffer for the gospel and be servants. The gospel has advanced because people have been self-disciplined and supported the work and prayed for it. And the gospel has been advanced because people are prepared to meet unconverted people where they are. It's God's work, and these things are far more important than being the latest trendy person or having the latest initiative. God will advance the gospel. We pray that this passage would help us in that task.